The untold story, why the giant had to fall. In the history of human conflict, there is no moment more iconic, more shocking, or more profound than the day a shepherd boy stepped onto a field of war to face a monster. We all know the names David and Goliath. They have become the universal shorthand for the underdog versus the oppressor, the small versus the massive, and the impossible versus the inevitable. But what if I told you that this wasn't just a lucky shot? What if I told you that the victory was decided long before the stone ever left the sling? For 40 days, the Valley of Elah was a theater of psychological warfare. Every morning and every evening, a champion of Gath named Goliath stepped into the light. He wasn't just a man, he was a walking fortress, draped in bronze, carrying a spear the size of a weaver's beam. His voice didn't just carry, it crushed. He stood there and mocked the living God, paralyzing an entire nation with a single weapon, fear. King Saul and his seasoned warriors were trapped in a cycle of terror. They looked at the giant's height, they looked at his armor, and they calculated their own defeat. They saw a problem that was too big to solve. But then came David. He didn't come with a rank. He didn't come with a sword. He came with a different perspective. David didn't see a giant that was too big to fight, he saw a target that was too big to miss. He didn't focus on the strength of the enemy, he focused on the faithfulness of the Creator who had already delivered him from the lion and the bear. This story is more than ancient history. It is a blueprint for your life. Right now, you are facing a Goliath. It might be a mountain of debt, a broken relationship, or a shadow of anxiety that follows you into the night. This introduction is your invitation to stop hiding in the tent of fear and start walking toward the battle line. It is time to realize that the same power that guided that stone is living inside of you today. Get ready to witness the most legendary showdown in history. This is not just about a boy and a giant. This is about what happens when human courage meets divine power. Let the battle begin. Chapter 1, The Taunt That Silenced an Army. The sun rose over the valley of Elah, but it brought no warmth to the hearts of the men of Israel. Below them, the dust settled between two massive ridges. On one side stood the Philistines, a war-hardened machine hungry for conquest. On the other side stood the Israelites, the people of the covenant, now huddled together in a state of absolute paralysis. The battle lines were drawn at Sokoh in Judah, but the actual fighting hadn't even begun. It didn't need to. The Philistines had a psychological edge that was 9 feet, 9 inches tall. The shadow of Gath. Out from the Philistine camp stepped their champion. His name was Goliath, and his presence alone was a death sentence to the morale of Saul's army. He was a mountain of a man from the city of Gath. Imagine the sight, a warrior whose height was recorded as 6 cubits and a span. Every step he took made the ground beneath him seem to tremble. He didn't just carry weapons, he wore a fortress. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield-bearer went ahead of him, a human wall protecting a man who already seemed invincible. The challenge in the valley. Goliath did not come to fight an army, he came to humiliate a nation. He stood and shouted across the expanse to the ranks of Israel. His voice echoed off the limestone hills, reaching the ears of every trembling soldier. "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" he roared. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects, but if I overcome him and kill me, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel." Give me a man and let us fight each other. The 40-day siege of fear. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. This was a daily ritual of degradation. For 40 days, every single morning and every single evening, the giant took his stand. He timed his appearances for maximum impact just as the sun came up to start their day and just as the shadows grew long and their courage grew thin. The Bible records a devastating reality. When Saul and all the Israelites heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and terrified. Fear is a thief. It stole the identity of the soldiers. It stole the authority of the king. Saul, the man who stood head and shoulders above his own people, was now hiding in the darkness of his royal tent. The men who were called to be warriors were now spectators of their own defeat. They were trapped in a valley of indecision, waiting for a miracle they didn't believe was coming. The nation was paralyzed. The prophecy of victory felt like a distant memory. The silence from the Israelite camp was the loudest sound in the valley, a silence born of the belief that some giants are simply too big to fall. Chapter 2, The Shepherd Enters the War Zone. While an entire army stood frozen in the valley of Elah, life continued in the quiet hills of Bethlehem. But the atmosphere was shifting. The tension of the war was reaching every household, including the home of an elderly man named Jesse. He had 8 sons, and the 3 eldest Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah were already on the front lines, supposedly fighting for the glory of Israel. But there was one son who stayed behind. The youngest. The one who spent his days in the solitude of the wilderness, watching over a few sheep. His name was David. A father's mission. Jesse was a man burdened by the silence of the battlefield. He hadn't heard from his sons in weeks. He gathered David and gave him a simple, humble task that would unknowingly change the course of history. Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread, Jesse commanded. Run to the camp and see how your brothers are doing. Bring back some guarantee of their safety. David didn't complain about the menial task. He didn't argue that he was destined for bigger things. He rose early in the morning, left the flock in the care of a hired shepherd, and loaded up the supplies. He was a boy on an errand of mercy, carrying bread to men who were starving for courage. The sound of defiance. David reached the camp just as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting their war cries. It sounded like a confident army. It looked like a powerful force. But as David left his things with the keeper of supplies and ran to the front lines to greet his brothers, the atmosphere changed instantly. Out from the Philistine ranks stepped the monster of Gath. Goliath began his daily routine of mockery. As the giant shouted his usual defiance, David didn't just hear the noise, he heard the insult to his God. He watched in shock as the professional soldiers of Israel, men trained for combat, turned and fled in terror the moment they saw the giant's face. The question that stirred the camp. The soldiers began to whisper among themselves, "Have you seen this man? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will even give him his daughter in marriage." But David wasn't interested in the king's riches. He was moved by a righteous indignation that no one else seemed to feel. He turned to the men standing near him and asked a question that cut through the fear like a knife. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The fire of betrayal. The first opposition David faced wasn't from the giant, it was from his own blood. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger. He tried to shut David down with shame. "Why have you come down here?" Eliab demanded. "And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. Eliab saw a few sheep and a wicked heart, but God saw a king and a deliverer. David didn't let the bitterness of a brother stop the calling on his life. He simply replied, "Now what have I done? Can't I even speak?" David turned away from his brother and continued to speak the truth. He was a shepherd in a war zone, the only man in the valley who realized that while Goliath was big, he was nothing compared to the God of Israel. Word began to spread through the ranks like wildfire. There was a boy in the camp who wasn't afraid. And soon, that word reached the ears of King Saul himself. Chapter 3, The King's Armor and the Shepherd's Faith. The whispers in the trenches grew into a roar. Word finally reached the royal tent that a young man was speaking not of retreat, but of victory. King Saul, desperate for any glimmer of hope in a 40-day darkness, summoned the boy. When David stepped into the presence of the king, he didn't bow in fear. He spoke with the authority of a man who had already seen the end of the story. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine," David declared. "Your servant will go and fight him." The logic of men vs. the logic of God. Saul looked at the young man standing before him, likely travel-worn, smelling of the sheepfold, and lacking a single scar of military service. The king's response was a cold splash of reality. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." Saul was looking at the statistics. He was measuring height, weight, and years of experience. But David was measuring something else. He began to recount a resume that hadn't been written in a military academy, but in the lonely, dangerous hills of Bethlehem. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep," David explained. "When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." David's confidence wasn't in his own hands, but in the one who guided them. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." The trap of the wrong armor. Stunned by this conviction, Saul finally relented. "Go, and the Lord be with you," he said. But then, the king tried to do what the world always tries to do. He tried to make David fight like everyone else. Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on the sword over the tunic and tried to walk, but he couldn't move. He looked like a child playing dress-up in a giant's world. The armor was heavy, restrictive, and most importantly it wasn't him. "I cannot go in these," David told Saul, "because I am not used to them." The power of authenticity. In a bold move of spiritual clarity, David stripped off the royal bronze. He rejected the king's protection because he knew it would only hinder his movement. He didn't need a sword he hadn't tested, he needed the God he had trusted for years. David chose to stay a shepherd. He took his staff in his hand and walked down to the stream that ran through the center of the valley. He wasn't looking for a miracle weapon, he was looking for 5 smooth stones. He placed them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag and gripped his sling. The army watched in stunned silence. There was no clanking of metal, no shine of a shield. Just a young man in a simple tunic walking into the no man's land between two civilizations. David knew that if he fought with Saul's weapons, he would fail like Saul. To defeat a giant, you don't need to become a giant, you need to remain a servant of the Most High. With 5 stones and 1 heart full of fire, David stepped out to meet the man who had terrified a nation. The stage was set for the most lopsided battle in history, but the world was about to learn that victory is not found in the weight of the armor, but in the spirit of the warrior. Chapter 4, 5 Smooth Stones and the Name of the Lord. The silence in the valley of Elah was heavy, broken only by the sound of David's footsteps on the dry riverbed. On the ridges, thousands of men held their breath. This was the moment where the mockery was supposed to end in a bloodbath. As David approached the center of the valley, the massive shadow of Goliath began to move. The Philistine moved forward, his shield-bearer walking before him like a human wall of bronze. He was a professional killer, a man who lived for the harvest of war. When he finally got close enough to see his opponent, he didn't feel threatened, he felt insulted. The giant's contempt. Goliath looked David over. He didn't see a warrior, he saw a ruddy, handsome boy with a staff and a bag. He saw a child sent to do a man's job, and he felt the sting of a joke he wasn't in on. "Am I a dog," Goliath roared, his voice booming off the valley walls, "that you come at me with sticks?" The giant began to curse David by his gods, calling down the wrath of Dagon and the Philistine deities. He held up his massive spear and made a terrifying promise. "Come here," he sneered, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." Goliath was using the oldest weapon in the world, intimidation. He wanted David to look at the spear. He wanted David to look at the 9-foot frame. He wanted David to realize that, physically, he stood no chance. The declaration of war. But David didn't flinch. He didn't look at the giant's height, he looked at the giant's target. David stood his ground and spoke with a voice that didn't tremble. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a prophetic decree that would ring through the centuries. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," David shouted, "but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David didn't stop there. He laid out the entire battle plan before a single stone was thrown. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." The theology of the battlefield. In front of two nations, David revealed the secret of his strength. He looked at the trembling Israelite army behind him and the arrogant Philistine army before him and declared the truth. "All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." David had completely shifted the narrative. This was no longer a fight between a boy and a giant. This was a confrontation between a man of flesh and the creator of the universe. Goliath thought he was fighting David, but David knew that Goliath was fighting God. The sprint toward the storm. Most men, when faced with a giant, back away slowly. They look for an exit. They wait for the enemy to make the first move. But as the Philistines started to move closer to attack, David did something that defied all military logic. He ran. He didn't run away. He ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. He reached into his shepherd's bag, his fingers finding the cool, smooth surface of one of the stones from the stream. He didn't need all 5. He didn't need a second chance. He placed the stone in the leather pocket of his sling, whirled it above his head, and let it fly with the momentum of every lion he had ever fought and every prayer he had ever prayed. The stone hissed through the air, a tiny pebble destined to bring down a mountain. The time for talking was over. The time for the giant to fall had arrived. Chapter 5, The Fall of the Giant and the Shout of Victory. The stone whistled through the air, cutting through 40 days of silence and fear. It was a small thing, a smooth pebble from a common stream, but it was carried by the breath of the Almighty. Goliath, the man who had terrified an entire kingdom, didn't even have time to lower his visor. He didn't even have time to raise his shield. The stone struck the Philistine squarely on the forehead. The Bible says it sank into his brow. The impact was absolute. In an instant, the mountain of bronze and ego collapsed. The giant didn't fall backward in a struggle, he fell face down on the ground, hitting the earth with a thud that echoed across the entire valley. The champion of Gath, the invincible warrior, was defeated by a single strike from a shepherd's sling. The finality of the victory. David didn't wait to celebrate. He ran and stood over the fallen giant. Looking down at the man who had cursed his God, David realized he didn't even have a sword of his own. He reached down and drew Goliath's massive blade from its sheath, the very weapon intended for David's destruction, and used it to finish the work. He cut off the giant's head, proving to every witness that the threat was truly over. When the Philistines saw that their hero, their protector, and their guaranteed victory was dead, the atmosphere of the valley shifted from arrogance to absolute terror. They didn't stay to fight. They didn't stay to negotiate. They turned and ran for their lives. The awakening of the army. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout. This wasn't the shout of a frightened people, it was the roar of an army that had finally remembered who they were. They pursued the Philistines all the way to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. The bodies of the enemy were strewn along the Sha'araim road. The Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camp. The valley that had been a place of shame for over a month was now a place of abundance. The head of the giant. David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he kept the giant's weapons in his own tent. They were no longer symbols of fear, they were trophies of God's faithfulness. As David walked back into the camp, Abner, the commander of the army, brought him before Saul. David was still holding the head of the Philistine in his hand. The king asked, "Whose son are you, young man?" David simply replied, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." The revolution of faith. The story of David and Goliath ends not just with a dead giant, but with a living hope. David proved that you don't need the world's equipment to win the world's battles. He proved that one person standing in the name of the Lord is a majority. The giant didn't fall because David was a great warrior. The giant fell because David served a great God. Today, let this story remind you that your battle is not your own. The same God who directed that stone into the forehead of Goliath is directing your steps right now. Your giant is loud, it is tall, and it is intimidating, but it is also temporary. Stand your ground. Pick up your stones. Run toward the battle. Because when you fight in the name of the Lord, the giant has no choice but to fall. The battle is the Lord's. The victory is yours. Chapter 6, The Aftermath and the Birth of a Legacy. The dust in the valley of Elah eventually settled, but the world was forever changed. The victory over Goliath was not just a military win, it was a spiritual revolution. For 40 days, the identity of Israel had been the terrified, but in a single afternoon, they became the victorious. David, the boy who was overlooked by his brothers and doubted by his king, walked off that field as the beacon of hope for an entire nation. The covenant of brotherhood. As David finished speaking with Saul, a powerful new connection was forged. Jonathan, the son of the king and a mighty warrior in his own right, watched the young shepherd with awe. The Bible says that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and he loved him as himself. Jonathan did something unheard of, he stripped himself of his royal robe and gave it to David, along with his tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt. It was a symbolic passing of the torch. The prince recognized that the Spirit of God was now resting on the shepherd. David had entered the valley in a simple tunic, but he left it clothed in the honor of a kingdom. The Song of the Streets. As the troops returned home, the celebration spilled out into the cities. Women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. But the lyrics of their song sent a shock wave through the palace. They sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. From that day forward, David could no longer hide in the shadow of the sheepfold. He was no longer just Jesse's youngest son, he was the giant slayer. His name became synonymous with the power of God. While this sparked a dangerous jealousy in the heart of Saul, it sparked a fire in the hearts of the people. They realized that if a boy with a sling could bring down a giant, then nothing was impossible for those who trusted in the living God. Your stones, your victory. This story doesn't end in the Bible, it continues in your life. The chapter 6 of your story is what you do after you face your fears. David's victory didn't just remove a threat, it prepared him for a throne. The trials you are facing today are the training grounds for the leadership you will exercise tomorrow. The stones David picked up were smooth. They had been shaped by the constant rushing of the water over many years. In the same way, your character is being smoothed by the pressures and challenges of life. When the moment comes for you to stand in your own valley of Elah, you won't be using raw, jagged edges, you will be using a faith that has been refined by the river of God's grace. The final promise. Goliath was a champion of the flesh, but David was a champion of the spirit. The world will always have its Goliaths, problems that look too big, voices that sound too loud, and odds that seem too high. But the testimony of the shepherd remains true, the battle is the Lord's. You don't need to be the strongest, the tallest, or the most experienced. You only need to be the most willing. Step out of the tent. Reject the heavy armor of the world. Trust the name that is above every other name. The giant has fallen. Your breakthrough has begun. Walk in your victory tonight. Chapter 7, From the Valley to the Throne. The fall of Goliath was not the end of David's journey, it was the violent birth of a destiny that could no longer be contained. When David picked up that giant's head, he wasn't just holding a trophy, he was holding the keys to a kingdom. The Valley of Elah had served its purpose. It was the classroom where a shepherd learned that he was actually a king. The transformation of a nation. Before this day, the men of Israel were defined by what they were running from. After David, they were defined by what they were running toward. The courage of one person had become contagious. This is the David effect. When you have the bravery to stand up to the giant in your family, the giant in your workplace, or the giant in your mind, you give everyone around you the permission to be brave too. The Bible shows us that later in David's life, he led a band of men who were once distressed, in debt, and discontented. But because they followed a giant slayer, they became giant slayers themselves. The legacy of that one stone in that one valley produced a generation of warriors who no longer trembled at the sound of a Philistine shout. The armor of character. Saul had tried to give David physical armor, but David had spent his youth building spiritual armor. Every day in the wilderness, when no one was watching, David was practicing. He practiced his aim, he practiced his praise, and he practiced his presence with God. The world sees your Goliath moment, but God sees the years of lion and bear moments that prepared you for it. Your private victories are what determine your public breakthroughs. You don't get strong on the battlefield, you show up to the battlefield already strong because of the time you spent alone with the Father. The Eternal King. Centuries after David stood in that valley, another descendant of his would stand on a different hill. Jesus, the Son of David, stepped onto the battlefield of Calvary to face the ultimate giants, sin and death. Just like David, he didn't use the world's weapons. He used sacrifice. He used love. And just like David, his victory wasn't just for him, it was for all of us. When David defeated Goliath, the army of Israel got to share in a victory they didn't fight for. When Christ defeated the grave, we got to share in a life we didn't earn. Your final decree. As you close this chapter of the story, look at your hands. They might feel small. They might feel tired. But remember, they are the same hands that the Creator of the stars uses to do His greatest work. The stone is your faith. The sling is your worship. The target is the lie that says you aren't enough. The giant is already defeated. The victory was won the moment you decided to show up and trust in the name of the Lord. Now, walk out of your valley, leave the fear behind, and step into the royal calling that has been prepared for you since the beginning of time. The giant is down. The King is coming. Amen. Chapter 8, The Secrets of the 5 Stones. We often focus on the impact of the stone that fell the giant, but we must look closer at the preparation behind it. David didn't just grab a handful of dirt, he went down into the valley, into the running water of the brook, and carefully selected 5 smooth stones. In the ancient world, a slinger was as accurate as a modern-day marksman, but even with incredible skill, David knew that the physical weapon was only a vessel for a spiritual truth. Those 5 stones represent the tools God has placed in your hands today to ensure that your giant doesn't just fall, but stays down. The first stone, past deliverance. David stood before Saul and talked about the lion and the bear. He didn't focus on the giant's height, he focused on God's track record. The first stone you must carry is the memory of God's faithfulness. If He brought you through the last storm, He is not going to let you drown in this one. Your history with God is your greatest weapon against your future fears. The second stone, identity. Goliath tried to define David as a dog or a boy. But David knew he was an anointed servant of the Most High. The second stone is knowing who you are. When the world tries to label you by your mistakes or your limitations, you must reach for the truth that you are chosen, royal, and protected. A giant cannot defeat someone who knows they belong to the King. The third stone, the power of the tongue. Before the stone ever flew, David spoke victory into the atmosphere. He told the giant exactly what was going to happen. The third stone is the prophetic decree. Your words have the power of life and death. Stop telling God how big your giant is, and start telling your giant how big your God is. Command your mountain to move in the name of the Lord. The fourth stone, holy courage. David didn't wait for Goliath to strike first, he ran toward the battle line. The fourth stone is action. Faith without works is dead. You cannot pray for a door to open if you aren't willing to walk through it. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision that something else, the glory of God, is more important than that fear. The fifth stone, total surrender. David knew that if he missed, he was dead. He had no backup plan, no secondary armor, and no exit strategy. He was all in. The fifth stone is absolute trust. When you stop trying to fix it with your own strength and finally hand the sling to the Holy Spirit, that is when the impossible happens. Why 5 biblical scholars often point out that Goliath had 4 brothers in the city of Gath. David wasn't just prepared for one giant, he was prepared to take out the whole family. He wasn't just looking for a temporary fix, he was looking for a permanent victory. God doesn't want to just give you a good day in the midst of your trouble. He wants to give you a legacy of triumph. He wants you to be so prepared in your spirit that even if 4 more giants show up, you've still got stones left in your bag. You are prepared. You are equipped. You are ready for the win. Chapter 9, The Silence After the Shout. The roar of the chase had faded into the distance. The dust that had been kicked up by thousands of fleeing Philistines began to settle back onto the rocks of the valley of Elah. For the first time in over a month, there was a strange, heavy silence, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of awe. David stood in the center of that valley, breathing heavily, looking down at the empty space where a mountain of a man once stood. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but his heart was at peace. He had done what an entire professional army couldn't do, not because he was the strongest, but because he was the most surrendered. The internal shift. There is a moment after every great victory where you have to decide who you are going to be. Are you going to be the person who takes the credit, or the person who gives the glory? David didn't celebrate by boasting of his aim or the quality of his sling. He stood there as a witness to the fact that the little things in God's hands are greater than the huge things in the hands of man. The soldiers who had been trembling in their boots just hours ago were now patting David on the back, claiming him as their hero. But David's eyes weren't on the crowd. He was looking at the horizon, realizing that the giant was only the beginning. The valley had been his testing ground, but the wilderness was coming, and eventually, the throne. The giant's sword. One of the most profound moments in this chapter of David's life is when he realized that the enemy's weapon was actually his provision. Goliath brought a sword to kill David, but David ended up using that very sword to prove the giant was dead. This is a spiritual principle for your life today. The very thing the enemy meant for your destruction, that trauma, that setback, that evil plan, is the very thing God is going to use as a tool for your future. The weapon formed against you will not prosper. In fact, it will eventually become a trophy in your hand to show others that God is a deliverer. The perspective of the king. As David walked back toward the camp, he wasn't just a shepherd anymore. His walk had changed. His vision had changed. He had looked death in the face and watched it blink. Most people spend their lives avoiding the valley. They pray to never see a giant. But David understood something we must all learn: the valley is where you find your voice. You don't find your strength on the mountaintop where everything is easy, you find it in the low places where you are forced to rely on God or fail. Your reflection. Take a moment to look at the silence in your own life right now. Maybe the battle has just ended, or maybe you are waiting for the stone to hit. Don't fear the quiet. It is in the quiet that God confirms your victory. Don't fear the weapon. If God is for you, the enemy is actually bringing you the tools for your own promotion. Don't fear the valley. It is the only road that leads to the palace. The giant is gone. The air is clear. Now, it's time to prepare for the next step of the journey. You were born for this, and the God of David is walking right beside you. The shadow is gone. The light has won. Final call to action. We have journeyed through the fire and the valley together. If the story of David and Goliath has transformed your perspective, like this video to help spread the message of hope. Share this with someone who is currently facing their own giant. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of inspiration. Type "I am a giant slayer" in the comments to seal this word in your heart. May the peace of God guard your heart and the strength of David fill your soul. Until next time, stay in the faith and keep winning the battle. Amen.